And over years and generations, you start seeing how the seeds of that institutionalized racism had played out in new generations. The amount of white people who stood up in this period since January to now, and they also like post out the real genocide, and you'll see the post they make of people dancing, singing together, holding one another in comfort. And that's a sense of recognizing that to build a non-racial society, a non-sexist society, an equal society, takes work. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable work. You're gonna be pushed as white people, as Indian people, as black people, because that's the work towards a vision. The reason why I worked with young people specifically is because that's the generation that is open to learning and engaging, and they're also living this experience. They're living in inequality. They're living in poverty. They're living in experiences in which violence is affecting them.
Welcome back to another episode of Colorful, where we unpack race, identity, and the stories that shape us. I am Senamile Zungu, joined here by my dazzling millennial bestie, Stacey Jane. Stace, you're back in your Dive City, the city of gold. Hello.
I am. But do you know what? I don't understand why you always have to tell everybody about the 15-year age gap between us.
Excuse me, it's 12. It's 12 years. Why are you bridge the distance?
12 years. It is so good to be back. Ironic as well, because we'll be launching this episode in Youth Month. So I hear your play on millennial there. And speaking about Youth Month, what we want to do today is talk to the type of people who speak about history, who have an understanding of history, but are also a big part of shaping the future. That's what we're doing today.
Yep, and no one fits that brief better than our guest here today, because from all the way to community engagement to the United Nations, forming some of the most prominent youth programs in the country, you have a bio that we would spend this entire episode getting into, but more pertinently today, you are head of education for We the People, which is an organization dedicated to educating and helping individuals understand how empowering our constitution is and its impact on our country. So without further ado, hello, Irfaan Mangera. Welcome to Colorful.
Hello. Thank you both for hosting me on Colorful. It's an exciting time to be here. I'm actually pretty grateful for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thanks, Irfaan. Now listen, before we get started, you know what's coming, eh?
I don't.
You don't.
You know what's coming.
You know what's coming. And you know what? We have yet to have a guest say no. Okay. So there is a bottle of red nail polish. Okay. It's actually quite pinky red today, so I don't know about this. Yeah, I don't know about this tone you found.
Fire red.
Is it fire red?
Yeah, this
looks
is
pinky red to me. Sunset.
Okay.
So we're gonna ask Irfaan to paint one hand of nails red. And he doesn't know, just one hand. He doesn't know whether we have the nail polish remover with us.
Okay.
And he's got another interview to run to.
There is a red jersey.
Oh, look at that. The coordination. I love me a detail. And Irfaan, while you're doing that, because we find some of our guests struggle with the multitasking, and if you're me and Stace, you will struggle with the multitasking. We are speaking about generational differences and youth, and it's Youth Month and all the stuff, Stace, as you highlighted, that we have a gap. Doesn't matter to me. Age is just a number. But generations will always say that, oh my goodness, you guys are so concerned with trivial problems. Do you see that across every generation? So what I want to know is, this is a safe space. Let's rant before we get into the serious stuff. What are the trivial issues? Like something that's grating you this week that you would not admit in public because it's so trivial. This is a safe space to admit it. Stacey, you go first.
Literally on the drive here, I was getting frustrated because I have 3 separate calendars, as you well know. And they're meant to be integrated, but the tech doesn't work, and that is not a user issue. It is or it isn't, I don't know.
It's a you issue.
And I couldn't get the 3 to talk to each other. And I triple booked myself, and I was hella irritated because the only person I could be irritated with was myself.
So valid. Cool. We hear you, Stace.
Yeah, look at this.
You did that in record time.
Well.
I'm trying, but yeah.
Can we get a close up, everybody?
Listen, it's not my best work.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good.
And he's en route to YFM after this, so are you going to show it off?
I might actually. Let's see what I can. That's it.
Irfaan, what's grading you this week?
Maybe a bit of technology, but also I think just frustration of online chatter in how South Africans are responding to 49 people going abroad, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, and that is certainly not trivial, and we will get into all of that today. And just to close off my trivialness, Stace, we were driving over here to the studio, and I still drive a manual vehicle, so that clutch control with these boots is not cute.
First world problems.
First world problems. But let's get into everything today that we really want to speak about, because we have quite some stuff to unpack. So yeah, thanks Irfaan for joining us, and thanks for the red.
Yeah, I hope it can come off. I hope that remover is here. I trust you guys a whole lot by doing this.
So Irfaan, can you give us a little bit of a history of who you are, your upbringing, the community that shaped you?
Absolutely. My name is Irfaan Mangera of the Mangeras of 14th Street Fitas. Fitas, as you know, is pretty close to where we are today. But in the 1970s, they were forced out of their homes and their business. It was bulldozed under the Group Areas Act of Apartheid and forced to go stay in Lenasia. I didn't experience that, but I grew up with the stories and the history and the sense of trauma, but also belonging that they yearn for. Being someone who grew up in Lens, it was everyone who looked like me or looked similar to me believed in similar things. So in a way, it was nice because there's a familiarity. But the challenge was that this was a forced removal area in which people who were Indian were forced to live. The same with Soweto and the same with El Dorado Park. And those communities often did try to mix, but it wasn't. The barriers were still firm. I schooled in Lens at Al-Aqsa, a Muslim school. Very fascinating experience because priority was an academic achievement. But I also challenged the school in some ways. And one of that was to get the sports established. There was no arts and culture, but at the very least we could do one fight. And we won. We got to play cricket for a tournament that was happening, eventually won that tournament as a captain, which was pretty fun. But growing up in Lens was a very rooting experience. The south of Joburg, as you know, is very poor, doesn't have a lot of development, grows in migration every year because of, from all over the continent, people come and establish homes, and informal settlements keep growing. And the challenges just keep growing. Part of that experience was just me getting involved in activism very young. I had family who was involved in the struggle, but also my immediate family, specifically my dad and uncle, were part of a cricket club. And cricket actually helped me establish my sense of mobilization and activism, because in as much as it was about sport, I later took on more senior roles, and by the age of 16 was elected to lead as part of the club. So there's different parts of me that speak to who I am. I never really, when people ask where's the origin story, the whole story is partly developed into this one big chaotic activist bowl, because I also joined the Kathrada Foundation, and that leadership program really allowed me to meet people like Ahmed Kathrada, understand racism, understand discrimination, and start thinking about society beyond just myself and this Lens boy who grew up in those dusty streets cycling around. I can go on, but that is the history. It's intertwined in a bit of struggle, but also very rooted in family and community, both from a faith perspective, from, there's no free lunches, so I also had to go and work at my dad's shop every opportunity I had, which was actually a really awesome experience. Developed a lot of skills from that as well.
Did I not tell you that Irfaan has the sort of bio that's more befitting for a documentary? And thank you for giving us that very that overview of your early childhood and your context. I want to go a little bit deeper into the effects of the Group Areas Act and the forced removals. And I know you mentioned in your answer just now that it didn't happen to you personally. Can we talk about, though, the historic and inherited trauma and what the weight of that displacement has personally manifested like in your life and what you see in your community?
Of course. And I think I always find myself challenged every time I speak about it, because there's always more to unpack. each and every time. Fitas was a unique community in that it was diverse. It had people from all walks of life, had a very vibrant economic hub in which, so the street that my family came from was that street where people would come and buy fabric, clothes, food, all sorts of things. That displacement left people yearning for some sense of community. And I say this because we now you had different religious groups, different people of different beliefs who are now forced to Lent. Lent in itself was very accepting and tolerant of difference, but to an extent. And over years and generations, you start seeing how the seeds of that institutionalized racism had played out in new generations. Mm-hmm. And why I spoke about my school in that way, my own friends and peers grew up in a very fixed way. I think if it wasn't for me getting involved in activism, sports, culture, I don't think I would have broken those bounds, because it's so insular. Those communities have become so insular. And in as much as you want to break those and start opening up space to say our struggles are shared, the same thing happening here in El Dorado Park is the same experience, in Soweto is the same experience. So on that front, as a young person, it is challenging. But I grew up with the stories. And Don Matera, the late Don Matera, the poet, who reminded us that memory is a weapon. And I say this because a lot of the old families who come from Fitas, my own included, you don't speak about it as much. And even though the claims to the land are still ongoing in the court, they sort of have released this from their life as if it hasn't happened. And I think it's a painful story, because why would you forget such a big moment that traumatized you, that you physically were removed from a place that you called home? My own family only speak of the fun stories. It's very difficult to unpack the moments of when the bulldozers came and all of that. And I remember fondly growing up because my granny lived in Mayfair, and whenever we'd come this side, there was an excitement in my parents' eyes when they'd be like, hey, this is where our house used to be. This is where we used to run around the cemetery for sports, to train for sports. And my dad's still one of the fittest people I know at 65. But they don't speak about the other stuff. And that's really painful. And I think partly that trauma is passed down because I'm angry about it. I'm frustrated about it, that shouldn't have been the case. And if even though that it was the case, where's the outcome in which we find ourselves getting some form of closure? And that hasn't happened.
It hasn't. I was in an Uber a while back. So I live in Cape Town, and I was taking an Uber in Cape Town, and he was dropping me in Kenilworth. And as we kind of approached the area, he got really frustrated, kind of angry, and he was like, "I'm dropping you at this house. My family were removed from the property 2 properties down." Wow. And there he was dropping me at and then he said, "And I now live in Khayelitsha." And it's so traumatic, and obviously a lot of the reason why people would not be sharing those stories is because there's so much trauma sitting behind that, and it is so unclosed. And I don't know, it's clear that we haven't acknowledged the depth of the economic and psychological after effects and of this kind of trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, I have lots of friends in the Cape, particularly from places like Khayelitsha, Guguletu, places like Manenberg, who speak of those stories, who grandparents still remember where their homes were, what their neighbors used to cook. And that type of fond memory is also being erased. And why I said memory is a weapon is because I worry that my generation have, because of the way they grew up, have forgotten that this actually is an experience that we should remember. We should be actually establishing in our day-to-day lives as not just from a value perspective, but from where to from here. Because, the stories of Woke Up, and I was there about a week and a half ago, and it's painful to know that more and more people are buying up property, or at least companies are buying property. And such a major part of our heritage, especially in the Cape, is being erased. what do we do about this scenario? Because this shouldn't be the case for ordinary people who have faced systemic trauma, systemic violence, and now have to deal with the repercussions on their own. And unfortunately, like you, in his example, it's individualized. Like you've gone onto your own to solve this on your own. It's no longer the community standing firm in support anymore.
Because there was no power. I mean, there is obviously power in everybody coming together, but when you're constantly faced with that barrier that just doesn't allow it to continue, it's a hopelessness. Yeah.
And it's also, it sparks up this interesting discussion of intergenerational trauma, because as my parents grew up in homeland KZN, we know that the Bantu stance and the legislation around that were technically not even considered South African citizens. And I often speak about how dysregulated some of the elder generation in their emotions and sitting with the sort of somatic trauma. And I realized that at that moment, to be able to take in those things is actually a matter of it almost being a privilege, because you're in survival mode for so long, and the body's not designed to be in survival mode for so long. And that is the reality of Black and brown people and the legacy of apartheid. It's not like it's physical, it's psychological, and a survivalist mentality all the way, and there is some deep healing that needs to be done there, because that does pass down.
And what does that healing look like? Because it's so different for everyone. I remember being on Robben Island 3 or 4 years ago, and I was on a fellowship, and one of the former prisoners spoke about like he's dedicated his life now towards an arts program. And in as much as he's saying like that arts program is helping younger people in townships in Cape Town actually heal and deal with the gang violence and the trauma of all the violence that currently exists, it's helped him heal, because he doesn't think he's healed from the experience of being arrested, being imprisoned, etc. And I found that so bizarre, because, you know, people like him who've come through the struggle, who've sacrificed their lives, should have by now support to have had dealt with that, you know. But till today, he's old, he's gray, and he still has the sense that, you know, that's not a trauma that he can just let go of.
So where do we go from here is an important question. We haven't even begun to truly deal with the ramifications on that level. I also want to speak about something else in regards to apartheid spatial planning, because Stacey and I had a conversation with a good friend of ours, shout out Gagelo, and I didn't know. I grew up in KZN, and this is not a context that I knew about, but even the way that the apartheid government planned, like architected Soweto, is even according to tribes, and it almost like made perfect this hierarchy even, and a fertile ground for tribalism. And amongst Black and brown people, you touched about it a little bit, because of the system of apartheid, it also created hierarchies among race, with Black people being at the very bottom of that pecking order. In your activism, and as an Indian male from the community, Islamic Indian male, how do you, in your activism, approach that hierarchy?
It's in many ways, but it's very hard. One, it's recognizing that this is a problem. It is an established privilege that you have. Even though, like, my own family, we had to work, had to, you know, build a business. Oftentimes we speak about, and my dad and mom wouldn't speak about it all the time, but there were times where they'd not eat just to make sure everyone else had food. And those types of stories stick with you as an activist. But then you realize as you grow up that these privileges that you've grown into are not the same that everyone else has, because there's still 15 million South Africans, majority Black, majority women, who still don't have food or are food insecure. So what do we do about it? I you know, part of the frustration is that spatial planning is very difficult in this context to just solve immediately. But you also need political will today to solve it. You can't just it is what it is, you know. And unfortunately, I see a lot of that from some of our leaders who are like, you know, there's too much cost involved, and there's too much budget to be allocated to like bridge those divides. Soweto, Lens, El Dorado Park is sort of a triangle in which colored Indian Black people lived, organized, and what I enjoyed most about being in Lens, but in growing into the political arena, was that I've met a lot of the leaders from the Black consciousness movement specifically, and to an extent the ANC, who are speaking about how they organize between the three, because of how you are divided, but still we try to break those divides and create a sense of solidarity. How I've approached it was, again, recognizing the privilege I have as an Indian male who has some degree of privilege, but also understanding what needs to be done to break those barriers. We can't individualize this problem. It has to be systemic. And breaking those systemic barriers means policy shifts. It means strategic work through law. It's strategic work in advocacy that helps bring and bridge those divides. One of the things that I take from is the former chairperson of my club. His name was Dr. Abu Azvat. He had a practice in Soweto as a doctor, and he lived in Lens, and he was a good family friend, but he was also the chairperson of our cricket club, where I obviously took on as a part of a legacy project. And his institute and his philosophy around Black consciousness was that we are the same, our struggles are shared, and we need to be able to bridge those divides. And that's the philosophy that I've worked on for so long, because he was the prime example of how you can still be working in a place, you can live in a place, you can love who you want. And unfortunately today, because over 30 years, 40 years now, generations have grown up knowing only the insular communities, they've not been able to break it. So I've tried a lot of work. The Kathrada Foundation is one of the few in the country that have spearheaded anti-racism work. So there's a program around using anti-racism assemblies. I would cover every year at least 20,000 plus learners for that week, trying to fit in as many assemblies as possible. And these are schools not just in townships, it's schools in the suburbs, white-dominated schools where we'd find interest from teachers and principals to say, let's come and have this conversation. And it was actually fascinating because learners there would engage you. They won't just sit back and be like, okay, thanks, bye. And I like that about younger generations, not just Gen Z, but even younger. Alpha and AMA 2000s are really something. But that work at the AKF was unique because it also showed me the lack of will that the rest of civil society had around anti-racism.
Oh, and that is a topic that's a topic we discuss quite frequently. I think, and that's exactly it, right? So you speak about the legal system through the courts and the political system through the government and what needs to be done in those spaces. But I think that the other thing that really does need to be done is being involved at an individual level.
Yeah.
And the point that you just made there around how that needs to be done by all of us. And frequently what we do see is that people with privilege who don't necessarily need to be involved because the system works for them just aren't.
Yeah.
And so you don't see white people at rallies, and you don't see people protesting, and you don't see people being involved in in cultural activities that are going to be progressing our country forward, because there's just no need. And that level of apathy is just so painful. It's such an obvious, I'm just going to disassociate with this situation and rather say, oh, it's been 30 years. And I think there's a deep misunderstanding of what systemic racism looks like amongst people who don't want to be involved.
And those programs actually, started breaking down those notions and preconceived ideas that young people had about race, about, structural racism, about policy. And you do simple exercises that make them realize, for example, you could do a river of life exercise. We used to do this every year that I hosted a camp on Robben Island with young people. And the amount of emotions that brought out, because people don't understand the barriers that you have to cross to get to where you are today. And a lot of the time when you go through that process across race, you can actually then begin to understand what it's like for a young Black woman from a township versus a white man from suburbia, and the disparities actually become so much more clearer. And so those things are it's hard, but it's necessary. And I don't think our education system is geared up to solve for it. And that brings the question is then who? And each of us as individuals must be then willing to say, I'm raising my hand because I have power, I have influence. It might be a weekly engagement at a school. It could be in your church. It could be, at the mosque. For me, at least, the sports club was also a space in which we try to break those notions, because as a predominantly Indian team, of young people who didn't know how to play cricket at the time, but still went anyway. We played against teams in the suburbs who were predominantly white, whose families were there all the time to support them, who had the best kits, and you'd get there intimidated simply by them being white. And it took some time for me at least to actually start getting the rest of the team to not see them as lesser than, because that's what would happen often. You'd be the most talented, but come to that moment you go into shock. And as a cricketer, you have to show up on the day, because if you don't, you also let the team down. So we had that experience already as forms of racism and systemic racism, or perception as well, that just actually affected people in how we showed up, even in a recreational space like cricket.
And that makes so much sense, because we speak about it. If so much you're getting an implicit message as a young person in a developing mind that you are less than, of course you're going to internalize that, and it's going to show up in a way, do I feel confident in participating in a match? The implicit message and explicit is that I'm less important and less capable. So I can only imagine the impact of that. And going back to your young years, let's fast forward now. You are now head of education for We the People.
Yes.
And we want to talk about We the People. So can you tell our listeners, what is We the People and why was it founded?
So it's actually new for me, right? Because I just, Saturday would be 2 months since I've joined We the People as the head of education. It was started by 4 people. One of them, our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. And you'd know why he had a direct interest in this, is because the man was part and involved in the constitutional process of building and getting us a constitution. A very integral figure in doing so. And this foundation has the likes of Albie Sachs involved, the current chair is, Vali Musa as a former minister, people who are actually involved in the making of our constitution, which we often take for granted because we don't understand it as much. So this organization is primarily there to educate people, uphold and protect the Constitution, recognizing that it's a living document. It's not this set in stone thing that often young people assume that, we don't like this Constitution. But when you ask why, then you realize that they don't understand it fully. In fact, the reason why it's known as one of the best in the world is because of the way it's been designed. And so it's been a great couple of months. I know about it from a long time because the work has been impactful, but there's a sense now that we need to change gears. And already in this 2 months, we have explored so many different projects. On Saturday, I launched a project with justices of the Constitutional Court to teach young people about the Constitution. And this is a partnership that we want to pilot for now. We're taking 12 schools over the next few months, and then hopefully in the next few years, we expand this. And the reason why this organization exists is a study was done by the Foundation for Human Rights, as well as the Justice Department, that said 51% of this country only knows that there's a constitution and understands that this actually is there to protect you. And it's there to protect the most vulnerable. So you understand this dilemma. If only 51% understand it, what does it mean for active citizenship? What does it mean for recognizing your power as an individual, let alone a community? And this is a problem because if you don't have the information, you're already disempowered to act. And that's why it's become such a passionate project for us to make this work and explore so many different avenues, including podcasting, by the way.
Yeah, we've had that chat.
Yeah, we know a thing or two. I'm glad you spoke about shifting up the gears or wrapping up the ante a little bit. So let's speak about young people and their sentiment towards, actually, let me rather phrase it and say, I've seen certainly a mistrust in traditional institutions, more especially every time land redistribution issue comes up or spatial planning. There is this sentiment amongst young people and an understandable frustration that the Constitution and constitutionalism is not an empowering mechanism, but rather something that is inhibiting the progress, the sort of radical progress that needs to take place to undo the historic and the scale of spatial planning. What's your view on that?
There's different views. I'm of the opinion that the misunderstanding and misconception is being deliberate. It's been driven by a campaign to actually try to get away from the sense that the Constitution is there to protect the most vulnerable. And it is.
Wow.
I think the perception, and because we're online a lot, we're digitally savvy, a lot of young people are consuming information from TikTok. So you're very right about the fact that institutions have lost popularity. And that's not unique for South Africa. It's a global problem. Everywhere you go, there's institutions, political, social, economic, that are being rid of their societal status and privilege. And it's because young people are saying we're growing up in a world that actually doesn't care about us. Climate change is happening, but here you're telling us that we can't stop, more fossil fuels. Or on the one hand, there's no jobs, but you're not giving us solutions to how we solve for that jobs, or giving us the right education and skills to meet the current jobs. So young people are losing trust and faith in systems generally. But I think there is a sense of duty still. I don't think young people are completely apathetic. And I say I'll legitimize that by saying I've been in communities and I've spent a lot of time organizing young people. And you find that young people are involved. They're doing soup kitchens. They are running a sports program because they're passionate about other young people. And so it's often led by youth. The protests we're seeing in this country, every single day, 20, 30 protests, even more, are led by young people. So it doesn't showcase an apathy. It showcases that they have a sense of distrust and disillusionment about everything else. But their sense of power is not all but lost, and they still have that sense that I can do something about it. I just need a bit of a push. And when it comes to this work, I think building trust means showcasing that institutions can withstand attacks and it does the right thing, right? And it's difficult in a world where everything becomes gray when you're trying to decide yes or no, or black and white. And I think the Constitution has held itself firm. It's probably one of the few institutions that still have good confidence among South Africans in general, because it's not taken an approach of bias to one individual or not. It's been general, using the Constitution and the principles there to apply itself. You see it in cases where, a former president didn't want HIV medication to be TAC, and the TAC came in and fought for that fight. We hopefully will be honoring them in the next month, which we haven't announced yet. So hopefully this podcast comes out after that.
Scoop. You heard it here first.
But there's the reason why I personally, as a young activist, have gone into this work. I did have other offers, but I felt that this was the most important for this moment, because that young people actually should use the Constitution to fight for a better future. It has all the tools needed for us to push forward. The Bill of Rights specifically speak about all the things we're worried about: protecting our dignity, bridging divides for equality, and I think that's something that we don't know enough of, and we don't use enough in our discourse when we're speaking about how do we change things.
I think that highlights so clearly why the work that you guys are doing and sharing and educating at school level around the Constitution is so important. And just it's kind of like a side comment really, is just how much engagement there is that I've seen online whenever anybody with some ability to have done research puts forward a position that debunks some or other notion around the Constitution or around the government's response to some particular situation. It's as soon as it's debunked and understood in a little bit more detail that people really get engaged and involved. So I love the idea of that. I also love the idea of bite-sized pieces that people can consume. We've been speaking about short-form content for the longest time.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just really love the idea.
Actually go and see our content, right? It's very youth-centric, and it's debunking of different myths. One of the biggest myths young people had is that this Constitution was a Western imposed document, right? Yet the constitutional process took 2 years. There were 490 people involved. It's a project that we're actually now building a documentary and a book out of by interviewing all these people involved. and debunking it to say this was the largest public process in history, in South African history, in which the public could send in their views. There were radio shows that had segments to which the public could submit, I want this issue raised in the Constitution. There were newspaper bits. So it wasn't something imposed out of the blue. It was an actual process where the public and the people had a direct role in. And the 490 people are those who were elected in the first election in 1994, who made up the Constitutional Assembly. And that in itself, over 2 years, was spent negotiating, engaging, deliberating, fighting out in both the public space, but also in those halls that, no, we need this clause, we need this clause. It was actually done by us, the people. So it's bridging those gaps and bridging those myths that this wasn't something brought from elsewhere. It was us, the people, who decided this is what we want. And it's there to protect the most vulnerable. Yes, access to justice is another conversation, but it doesn't negate the fact that this Constitution is there and it has the ability to protect you.
And I also want to co-sign something you said about the younger generation, in that I don't think they're apolitical or apathetic at all. I think they're deeply passionate and values-based. And I think that to characterize them just because they're so hypercritical is not really understanding that there is approaching things with a critical lens is also a healthy discourse to be had. But of course, there is the downside of when fact and fiction, and whether or not we can even dispute fact, starts to pop up. And you mentioned you mentioned at the beginning of this interview what was grating you, and the 49 Afrikaner refugees. That is not something to laugh about, but it is something that's gotten me very angry. How does something like that even happen, where a misinformation, our government has taken an official position, there is no evidence that there is a mass genocide targeted towards white South Afrikaner farmers? How does it happen that they are granted refugee status on the basis of misinformation?
It's because you mentioned just now about, institutions losing its weight and politics being a place in which people are distrustful. And unfortunately, like I mentioned, globally this has impact. And in the US, we've seen that happen subsequent years after year, where all sorts of things can be said and sprung up, and people take it as truth and as fact, even though it is debunked. But we don't have the necessary platforms and the type of leaders who will stand up and do the right thing. It's all about the next vote rather than making sure we do what's right by people. And unfortunately, this has happened because on both ends, from the US side, but in South Africa as well, we've allowed for many groups and individuals to continue their escapade for so long, spewing racism, misinformation. It was News 24 like 2 weeks ago who showcased that this person who's masquerading as a farm owner was actually someone who just worked in his parents' I forget it was like a B&B, and this person was non-stop spewing all sorts of fiction and misinformation, and people were eating it alive. This is a problem. As South Africans, we need to start becoming more digitally savvy and safe, and it starts everywhere. I mean, our own families, we're sharing on WhatsApp often, all the time, all sorts of things, but there's no regulation ourselves, personal regulation, because also government can only do so much. At the end of the day, you as an individual have to take responsibility for your actions in what you're sharing, what you're consuming. I just don't think there's been accountability for a lot of people who carry out this misinformation. They continue to do so, and I it's frustrated me because you can see the disparities. There are people who are going from actual legit war zones, who are refugees trying to find food. There's a Gaza that has not had food in over 60 days, blocked off, the no aid. People who are sitting in Sudan, in Kashmir now, between India and Pakistan. All over the world, there's conflict zones. But suddenly these 49 people packed bags, airports ready, and
Yeah.
you question what this looks like. Is this actually a legitimate case? And you're starting to see backlash in the US from there was a senator yesterday who said this is nonsense and it's politically motivated rather than actually a legitimate claim for refugee status. The claims around white genocide has completely been debunked. The claims of, yes, farm murders are a problem, and all murder is a problem. Crime is a problem in South Africa, but it's not genocide. And this claim has been taken out of context and pushed by a certain group of people, and they've actually been happy about their position, and now trying, because of the mess they got us into, they're now trying to cast blame to Cyril Ramaphosa as our president and the party he belongs to. So I think we just need to get to a point where we're more honest, but that honesty must also lead to public shame, bring shame back, because these people are they're too confident in their racism these days.
So confident.
Yeah.
A conversation we had the other day as well, saying people seem to be so confident about being racist these days.
Yeah.
The climate is appalling. Things that previously people might just hold back on because that's not okay, is now just being openly spoken about without any, as you just said, without any repercussion.
Yeah.
I guess within that kind of global climate that is really doing its best to be anti-equality, anti-racial justice, anti-decolonialization, how do you tackle that in the education and advocacy space? I mean, I suppose we've touched on it a few times. I would love actually some really practical advice for individuals and collectives to approach this in their spaces, so that we're together moving in that kind of a healing direction, or at least in a
truth direction.
Thank you. That's a better word. Thank you.
Yeah. It's neither one or the other. It's truth. You have to stand for truth. The jersey I wore today it says, "Don't despair, organize and problem solve," and that basically sums up the message that I could relate to. I think for so long people have felt like they have no power, and yes, things are hard. Like some days, even myself sits back and we like, is this worth it? What are we doing? We're not gaining any traction. But then I reflect back on history, and history is the best teacher, and you can draw so many lessons from it. And Kathrada, Madiba, many others of that generation were in the struggle not for its fashionability or because it was popular. It was unpopular to do so at the time. They also felt backlash. They also had been arrested. They were beaten up. At Con Hill, where I'm based now, the stories of Winnie Mandela, the stories of different leaders who were brought there, who were arrested, who were tortured, even as young as 13 years old. And you ask them today, do you regret it? And they say no. We have to recognize as individuals that you do have power, and take lesson from those who walked the path before us, that it's going to be hard, but it's worth it in the end. Because the fight to bring a constitution meant that we can sit here today amongst different races freely, saying what we want. Where other countries in the world, you can't just do this. You'll be arrested for speaking out this way. And so there's power in our individual selves, but you have to recognize where you can have best influence. Not everyone can do it all over. And you're going to find maybe my church is the right space for me, because I'm spiritual. I love working with youth. I can organize them every week. We can then go out into the community, start speaking to people who are affected by the economic crisis. And mental health is an issue. So people often just need a hand or someone to listen to their problems. That's one way. You can use sports, arts, culture, but organizing doesn't have to be, constructed in the way I think for so long people thought, no, you have to be at a protest, right? It's not that. Organizing is literally you bringing people together towards an objective. It could be any objective. You want to support charity, come together, and it starts to build something. But the more you organize, the greater power you have, because doing it alone is not enough. The system wants you to do it alone, because when it knocks you out, you alone suffer. And that's not how we build communities that are strong. or communities that are functional and healthy and that stand up for each other. And I can see now, relating this back to my own story in Lens, that people are starting to do that. Service delivery issues are a problem. They're starting to stand up and say, no, we have to work together. Despite differences, this is a common issue. All of us don't have water. Obviously, it's a problem. So let's start working together. It's basics around organizing that I think people are too afraid to step up in. And this moment needs a bit of courage. Yeah. Well, wherever you get that courage from, we need a little bit of courage. And I'm seeing it more and more. The amount of white people who stood up in this period since January to now, and they also like post out, the real genocide, and you'll see the post they make of people dancing, singing together, holding one another in comfort. And that's a sense of recognizing that to build a non-racial society, a non-sexist society, an equal society, takes work. It's hard work. It's uncomfortable work. You're going to be pushed as white people, as Indian people, as black people, because that's the work towards a vision. No vision is going to be realized if you just sit back and wait for it to happen.
And as you were actually giving that answer, Stacey and I exchanged a knowing glance, because I think we look at this podcast as our way of organizing, and I think it gets incredibly difficult. You wonder if you are moving the needle. So I just want to personally say thank you for that, because it does feel affirming, and it is so heartbreaking more than ever in this climate right now. The more psychological effects of watching people being openly racist is something that's getting to me a lot. But it's also, as you said, about knowing where you can have the biggest impact and actually who is worth speaking to. And you referenced Ahmed Kathrada, and he says that one of the hardest things, quote, to open is a closed mind.
100%. Yeah. He, in many ways, because I worked for his organization, because I met him, a lot of my grounding always falls back onto him as this Indian male who had privilege also. One of the stories I can say quickly is during his trial, he actually had the opportunity to be requited, to not go to prison to Robben Island. And he made the decision to choose to go with his comrades because he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, this is a struggle. I can't be seen to be leaving this. What does it say to me, to my community, to the broader mission? And so he chose that sacrifice. And this is the type of people that I look up to, because they had wisdom that we often forget. And why, in as much as I'm a young leader and you'll always see me advocating for more young people to lead, we can't do this alone. It's a collective effort. And the people who've walked before us, they've experienced a lot more than we have. We have to tap in to a lot of that and build solidarity, real solidarity. And the art of solidarity is showing up. It's being able to say, is this a podcast that aligns to you? Can I come and speak? And it's yes, then you can come and do so, and keep doing so whenever that exchange is happening, and invite them to other things. And I think the same way I've been challenging people in the media, people in our charity space, because the one thing South Africans are also very good at is our sense of giving, of kindness. And you do see a lot of community institutions carrying out charity work for food, for clothing, etc. But that is one way that needs to be transformed into something deeper, because we need to move from charity to solidarity. And that is a bit more difficult, but it helps us start changing the system. And I think when we met a week or so ago, I spoke about the fact that dignity is a demand, and demands have to be fought for. You can't just sit back and wait for things to happen. It requires going consistently, despite differences. That generation, they all had differences. Trust me, now you see it where there's beef amongst each other. But they realize that there's a broader mission, and for us to tackle racism, discrimination, sexism, violence against women and children, all these things in society that makes us feel discouraged, makes us feel disillusioned, we have to be able to arrest it and say, no, not in my name.
and not in my name, and we all need to do that. And we spoke about it earlier, but particularly people with privilege who don't necessarily need to. You gave the example of Ahmed Khutrada, and in that circumstance, he was privileged in the fact that he had a choice. And each of us who have a choice at any given time need to consciously continue to step forward. I mean, I'm thinking about even in very individual spaces, in groups of friends, when there is a statement that is clearly just needs challenging, that's when we got to step up. We talk about being organized, but as individuals, every moment is an opportunity, especially when you're sitting with some level of privilege, and especially in a climate like this, because not speaking up is saying, cool, I'll let that be, I'll let that comment slide. And even though it does make me feel a little bit discomforted, the next time I hear it, it's easier to hear it.
Yeah.
And, sounds like a you problem, not a me problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that sounds like a you problem.
And I have noticed that there's been a shift, because 10 years ago, that was a practice where if you had a bra and you heard something, somebody called it out. Because of the way things have shifted and people have been so brazen about their racism and their hatred, I'm starting to see a shift, and people just joke it off and laugh it off. It's a comment is made, it's like, nah, it doesn't really mean it. It means something, because there could have been someone in that room who felt that way, and even if there weren't someone in that room, wrong is wrong.
I mean, it's particularly when there isn't someone in that room, because they can't be in that room, they didn't have access to that room. That's when you should be speaking up.
100%. One of the challenges around policy that South Africa is struggling with is this thing about privilege, and how the privileged have constantly asked of those who are not privileged to sacrifice. Yet they are not willing to make a sacrifice themselves. And this often is lent into the discourse around race, because that's the nature of how economics are still operating with in South Africa, where it's still white dominated. How do we then shift a scenario where white people are not willing to sacrifice a little bit so that everyone else can have a little bit more? And that's speaking about the table example. If you have a table, you have to extend the table for more people to come and eat, instead of just excluding people from the table.
It's horrible. It's horrible when you hear, I sit in those bars, and when you hear things like, yeah, I support equality, of course I do, but I'm willing to do absolutely nothing and share absolutely nothing. It must just be worked out in spaces, in legal spaces, in political spaces. It's everybody else's job except mine to sacrifice a little of what I have to create equality. It's not going to happen by mistake.
Nope.
And it's pretty hard to hear that from people you know and care about, who don't see it. And those are the places where people like me with privilege in those spaces need to be asking questions and pushing. A comment really.
It's also, Stace, sometimes I always say, as you've just said, is that it's always placed on Black people, Black and brown people, to explain and educate, and it's always faced as, okay, well, if you just say it in a way that's palatable, why do you have to be so angry, or deliver it in a different way? Constantly moving the needle and just constantly moving the goalpost about how we can approach conversations about race and privilege in this country. For me, I can't do that, because it's so disingenuous now. But I'm interested on your side, is how do you approach close-minded people? Is it worth sometimes, or are those moments where you can genuinely see, like in the workshops you held at school, and do those moments give you hope? And they've been moments that we've had on this podcast, and I'm like, gosh, I'm not interested in educating my people. And then someone will be like, okay, well, what you said actually really made me think. And then I'll be like, okay, I guess it makes it worth it if I just can, for a second, make you entertain that there may be a different perspective.
It does make it worth it. And I know it's emotional. It's meant to be, because it challenges our very core. And it forces us to think about, but is this this person my actual friend if they think this way, and if they believe this way? And it's it can also be family, direct blood relatives, and you're like, oh, but why are you thinking like this? And you challenge them, and you get to a point of, is this something you want to continue nurturing and forcing them eventually to see, or just breaking ties? And a lot of relationships have ended in that way. And a lot of people have just made compromise to say it's okay. It's a very hard and challenging experience to go through, and it has to be done. That's my challenge. It has to be done. You have to keep challenging and probing and doing the work to make people just have that moment of, oh, wait, okay, but you're making sense. And it's, again, the responsibility is on everyone. It's not just one way or the other. Do I have hope? I do. I have lots of hope. I think all revolutions have existed and started from hope. All change has started from hope. I have hope because Bongani in Loli stood up and said, you know, I want to tackle climate change. I'm worried about the food hunger in my community. And today there's a food garden that existed where they went to go and clean up. There's hope because Frida in Mabopane and at Ridgeville does work around the arts and culture, but doesn't get paid to do it, but still does it anyway. Has lost a brother, has lost a sister to GBV, but still stands up and say, I'm going to still do this work. So there's always hope. I can give you hundreds of names that are programmed in my head, and they know it because I've worked with them and I continue to help where I can. But the reason why I worked with young people specifically is because that's the generation that is open to learning and engaging, and they're also living this experience. They're living in inequality. They're living in poverty. They're living in experiences in which violence is affecting them. No one wants to live in a country that you can't walk outside. You like constantly second guessing yourself. Can I go to this festival? Am I gonna get mugged? Am I gonna get someone raping me or acting or murdering me? And those are the realities that young South Africans are growing up in. Realities that are very harsh for one to think about, for a young person to think about. And I often see this, especially when I do global work, in that our experience is very unique and similar to other countries, but majority don't fully grapple with what we have to, because it's so intense, it's so in your face all the time.
Yeah.
And the bubbles and pockets of privilege that exist will be broken, and they have to be broken. COVID showed us that when it was broken, people started saying, oh, wait, this is the level of hunger. Oh, wait, we're actually not so privileged because you're 2 checks away from being under the poverty line. And so we need more of that kind of engagement. And particularly the challenge for me is to the middle class of society, that strata, to start saying, where does my solidarity lie? Is it with all people, or is it with just maintaining my little privilege block? And that's the strata that I think upholds some of the status quo. And I think I come from it, so I'm speaking as somebody who wants us to start having more difficult conversations.
And on that note of hope, we want to thank you for coming to Colorful today. But before you go, we would like you to read the preamble, the opening lines of the preamble of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa.
Just because Jen is very dramatic.
I'm just so dramatic. In
your
your best
the plot.
Morgan Freeman voice over.
I definitely don't have a
Can
Morgan
you
Freeman
please
voice.
read that and remind our listeners just the sort of empowering mechanism we have in our Constitution?
Thank you, and thank you for letting me be here today. It's been an absolute privilege to have this conversation, and I hope for many more fruitful engagements for Colorful. However I can help also, please do let me know.
Thanks.
This Constitution is important to me and to all of us who want a society of equality and of justice. And this preamble always gets to me. In fact, it's probably going to get onto a t-shirt one of these days. But it is as part of the We the People merch. Please come through to our store that will be open soon enough.
You
nice
heard
plug.
that.
Yeah, very good.
We'll put the link here.
Yeah. So let me quote it by saying, we the people of South Africa recognize the injustices of our past, honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity.
Thank you, Irfaan.
Amazing.
Oh. See, we can all do. We can all do. Irfaan, thank you for joining us. Guys, we are looking for you to help us spread the word. That's what you can do in your individual capacity. Share the link to this kind of content with your friends and family. You'll find us on obviously all the normal podcasting platforms. We're on TikTok and Instagram. Till next time.